He is afraid that he might have murdered with it his wife, when, disguised as the old peddler, he finally was allowed into her room and into her bed. After this act, he discovers with horror that he has become a double of the old peddler. Awaiting the inevitable punishment for his crime, he contemplates suicide with a cup of the poisonous wine which was left to him by his mother, whose inadvertent sexual indiscretion may have been responsible for the death of his father. So in part 1 and 2, we have two alternative visions of the creative impulse: classical inspiration and Freudian sublimation. These are two parallel universes, which are each is shaped by the interpretative sensibilities of the narrative voice. In part 1, the narrator takes his cue from the Sufi literary tradition, in which the lover pines for a mystical beloved with whom physical contact is impossible. The narrator of part 2 resembles the modernist writer. His is the voice of a man acutely aware of his suppressed sexuality, of the malaise plaguing his soul, his psyche rather, and of his parents' poisonous legacy of sexual transgressions. In this reading of The Blind Owl as a parable of cultural reform, the idea of continuity is conveyed by the three main characters: a young man, an old man, and a young woman, which appear in both parts. Each character plays two parallel roles. The female character plays the role of the muse, the source of artistic inspiration. In part 1, as the virginal ethereal girl, we see her in two manifestations. The elusive apparition, which sends the pencase painter on his quest, is an archetypal figure, a Jungian archetypal figure, the essence of Iranian cultural identity. That is why even the crude paintings of the papier-mâché painter bear her imprint, or her features. The black-clad woman, whom the painter finds on the doorstep after his quest, is an embodiment of the classical ideal. She has a tangible, corporeal presence in his world, as do the classical masterpieces of Persian literature and art. Her death, dismemberment, and burial foreshadow the demise of the classical conventions and the destruction of the traditional form. Significantly, the story does not end with her death in part 1. In part 2, the female character appears again as a genuine woman, Zaneta Montmayor, a sexual being of flesh and blood, the object of the writer's suppressed desire, and thus a muse of a Freudian cast. It is my contention that the death of the ethereal girl and her reincarnation as La Côté, the harlot or the witch, represents the dramatic transformation of the Persian literary tradition, its transition to a new aesthetic mode. The character of the old man stands for the poet traditionalist, the custodian of the classical form, symbolized by the clay pot. In both parts of the novel, he offers the clay pot to the young man, to the next generation. In part 1, the old man unearths or digs out the ancient clay pot from rape, bringing a forgotten legacy out of oblivion, like the Bosbiash poets. In part 2, he is supposed to have produced the pot himself in his youth, when he was a potter, in other words, a craftsman, rather than a peddler. In both cases, the pot is wrapped in a dirty kerchief, which obscures its original design. The kerchief may be a symbol of a stylistic corruption, which obscures the inimitable simplicity, sahle montane, of the true classical form and poetic style. As for the figure of the old man, he may be derived from the modernist rhetorics of the literary debates of the 1920s and 30s. In part 1, his persona appears to be based on one of Hedayat's letters, quoted by Homa Katuzian, where Hedayat calls the traditionalist literati gravediggers. He is the one who digs the grave of the classical idea. The young artist only buries the decaying corpse, metaphorically as well as literally. The young man, who is also the narrator of the story, is the innovator, the inspired artist, who destroys the traditional form. The destruction may happen deliberately, as the dismemberment of the ethereal girl in part 1, or spontaneously, as he breaks the pot in his house in part 2. Paradoxically, in both parts of the novel, the agent of destruction is also committed to preserving and perpetuating the legacy of the past. For example, the painter in part 1 feels a compulsive desire to record on paper the eyes of the ethereal girl, which have closed forever. He intends to keep the picture always by his side. The writer in part 2 feels that he is the result of a long succession of past generations which have bequeathed their experience to him. He considers himself the custodian of that heritage, duty-bound to preserve. How are those two contradictory traits reconciled? The key is hidden in part 1, more specifically in the artist's treatment of the dead ethereal girl, the embodiment of the defunct classical ideal. His first impulse is to revive her, failing that, to preserve the features of the corpse in his own art. But he succeeds in preserving her only when he captures the mysterious, elusive glance. That, and not the form, is her essence. So how does the innovator capture and preserve the essence of the legacy left in his charge? The painter in part 1 does so by adopting the highly subjective manner of modern art. His model is no more than a starting point for him. The artist does not aim to present a photographic likeness of the ethereal girl, but to convey his impressions of her. So he selects only those features of the lifeless corpse which are significant for him. And here I quote, "My intention was to portray this form which was doomed slowly and gradually to suffer decomposition and disintegration, and which now lay still, a fixed expression upon its face. I felt I must record on paper its essential lines. I would select those lines of which I had myself experienced the power. I had now to bring my own mind into play, to give concrete form to an image which, emanating from her face, had so impressed itself upon my thought.